something disturbing just surfaced. Dr. Travis Taylor, the lead scientist on The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, broke his silence about a classified episode that was filmed but never aired. For 3 years, fans noticed a gap in Season 2. Episode 7 was skipped entirely, jumping from Episode 6 directly to Episode 8 with no explanation. The network claimed scheduling conflicts. Production logs listed it as postponed indefinitely, but crew members who were there that night tell a different story. And now, Travis Taylor has finally explained why the footage was locked away, why the Pentagon got involved, and why he'll never set foot in that specific location on the ranch again. This isn't about UFOs or strange lights anymore. This is about something that affected the team's perception of reality itself, something that, according to Travis, broke the fundamental rules of how time and consciousness are supposed to work. Before we dive deeper, subscribe now if you're fascinated by the unexplained, because what follows may change how you view everything that happens at Skinwalker Ranch. When Season 2 began airing in 2021, eagle-eyed fans immediately noticed something odd. The episode guide listed 10 episodes, but only 9 aired. Episode 7 was completely missing from all streaming platforms, DVD releases, and international broadcasts. The gap was so clean, so surgical, that casual viewers didn't even notice. But hardcore fans did. They pulled production schedules, cross-referenced behind-the-scenes photos, and found evidence that Episode 7 had been filmed. Social media posts from crew members in late 2020 referenced the Mesa experiment, a nighttime investigation at a specific location on the ranch that witnesses described as the most intense night we've ever had. Then, suddenly, all references vanished. Posts were deleted. Photos were scrubbed. When fans asked the official Skinwalker Ranch social media accounts about the missing episode, responses were identical and robotic. All available episodes are currently streaming. Travis Taylor himself appeared on a podcast in early 2021, looking visibly exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, voice hoarse, hands trembling slightly when he held his coffee cup. When the host casually asked about the season, Travis paused for an unnaturally long time, nearly 15 seconds of dead air, before saying, "We can't talk about everything we encounter out there. Some things require clearance levels we don't have." The host laughed, thinking it was a joke. Travis didn't laugh back. Instead, he looked directly into the camera and said something that sent chills through viewers. If you experience something that challenges the fundamental nature of causality itself, how do you even explain it? How do you show it to people without... He trailed off, never finishing the sentence. That clip circulated on Reddit for weeks before it too disappeared, pulled by the network for copyright reasons. But not before hundreds of people downloaded it, preserving Travis's haunted expression and that unfinished warning. Then came the leaks. Anonymous sources claiming to be production assistants posted fragmented accounts on paranormal forums. They described an investigation that started normally, but descended into something none of them could rationally explain. Equipment malfunctions were expected at Skinwalker Ranch. Strange lights, weird sounds, electromagnetic anomalies. That was all par for the course. But this was different. According to these accounts, the team's perception of time became unstable. Events happened out of sequence. People remembered conversations that hadn't occurred yet. And the footage, the raw footage that only a handful of people have seen, allegedly shows something that shouldn't be possible to record on a linear timeline. One leaked message, later verified to have come from someone with production credentials, read, "Travis kept checking his watch and insisting we'd been out there for 20 minutes. The camera timestamp showed 3 hours. When we checked our phones, some showed 9 p.m., others showed 2 a.m., but we were all standing in the same location. That's when Brandon ordered everything shut down." Brandon Fugel, the ranch owner, reportedly made an emergency call to his Pentagon contacts that same night. Within 48 hours, 2 men in civilian clothing arrived at the ranch with non-disclosure agreements and portable hard drives. They left with every piece of footage from that investigation. The episode was classified, not just banned, classified under a designation that several sources claim relates to temporal anomaly documentation. And for 3 years, Travis Taylor said nothing about it until now. The location where Episode 7 was filmed is known to the team as The Shelf, a flat, elevated section of land on the eastern side of the property, overlooking a deep ravine. Indigenous tribes in the area have avoided this spot for generations, calling it the place where time breaks. Early Spanish explorers documented strange experiences near the shelf, describing instances where travelers claim to have walked the same path multiple times despite moving forward or arriving at destinations before they had departed. Modern surveyors in the 1970s abandoned mapping the area after GPS equipment began showing their position in multiple locations simultaneously. When the Skinwalker Ranch team decided to investigate the shelf in October 2020, they knew its reputation. But Travis, ever the scientist, wanted hard data. He brought equipment specifically designed to measure temporal displacement, atomic clocks synchronized to GPS satellites, multiple cameras with hardwired timestamps, and sensors that could detect if local time moved at a different rate than the surrounding area. The experiment was simple in concept. Spend 6 hours on the shelf, running tests, measuring everything, and documenting any anomaly. They brought enough battery power for 12 hours just in case. What they didn't prepare for was the possibility that 6 hours might not mean the same thing in that location. According to Travis's recent statement, delivered in a private interview that was leaked against his wishes, the problems began before they even reached the shelf. We started hiking up at exactly 6:47 p.m., Travis explained, his voice carrying a weight that wasn't there in earlier seasons. I checked my watch multiple times. By the time we reached the top, it should have been around 7:15 p.m. But when we arrived, Dragon's watch said 9:22 p.m. Bryant's said 7:03 p.m. Mine said 6:52 p.m., 5 minutes before we had left. Initially, they assumed equipment malfunction. Watches could be wrong, but the camera timestamps were impossible to dismiss. 3 different cameras, all hardwired to internal clocks, all showing different times, and none of them matching what the team members remembered. That's when I knew we were dealing with something outside conventional physics, Travis said. You can't have 3 atomic clocks showing 3 different times in the same location unless space-time itself is fractured. They set up equipment anyway, determined to document whatever was causing the temporal distortion, and that's when things got worse. The cameras kept recording, but the footage showed events out of sequence. In one continuous shot, Travis is seen setting up a sensor array. In the next frame, the array is already complete and running. Then, 3 frames later, Travis is back to setting it up again, wearing different clothing than he had been wearing moments before. We thought the cameras were glitching, Travis explained, but when we reviewed the footage in real time on the monitors, we could see ourselves doing things we hadn't done yet. Not predictions, not premonitions, actual footage of future events playing in the present. Bryant Dragon Arnold, the ranch's security chief, reported seeing Travis walk past him toward the equipment while simultaneously watching Travis stand 15 feet away, talking into a radio. Both versions were solid, physical, real. When Dragon called out, both Travises turned to look at him. Dragon grabbed my arm, Travis recounted, his voice shaking slightly. He said, "Which one are you?" And I didn't know how to answer that question, because if he could see 2 of me, which one was actually me? Was I the one he was touching, or the one standing by the equipment? Or was I both, or neither? The team tried to leave. That's when they discovered the real problem. The path they had used to reach the shelf was gone. Not hidden, not blocked. Gone. The terrain had changed. Where there had been a gentle slope, there was now a sheer drop. The landmarks they'd used to navigate, a distinctive rock formation, a dead tree, existed but in different positions, as if the landscape itself had been rearranged. We were trapped in a location that was geographically unstable, Travis said, not just temporally unstable. The actual physical space was shifting. We'd walk 50 feet north and end up south of where we started. We'd head downhill and find ourselves going uphill. The footage from this period, the footage that only a few people have seen, allegedly shows the team walking in straight lines but arriving back at their starting point from different directions. Paths that should have been impossible, geometry that violated Euclidean space, and then the duplicates appeared. We started seeing ourselves, Travis said, and for the first time in the interview, he looked directly at the camera with an expression of pure, unfiltered fear. Not reflection, not hallucinations, physical duplicates. I watched myself walk past me. I heard my own voice having a conversation I hadn't had yet, or maybe had already had and was going to have again. Time wasn't just broken, it was looping and overlapping and splitting. Dragon reported seeing himself standing motionless about 30 feet away, just staring back at him. The duplicate's mouth moved, speaking words that Dragon heard in his own mind rather than through his ears. "You're not supposed to see this. We're not supposed to overlap." When Dragon stepped toward his duplicate, both versions moved simultaneously, mirror images, perfectly synchronized, until they weren't. The duplicate moved its hand a fraction of a second before Dragon moved his. Then it smiled, an expression Dragon insists he wasn't making. "That's when I understood," Travis said quietly. "These weren't duplicates. They were us from different timelines, different moments, existing simultaneously in the same space. The shelf wasn't just bending time. It was collapsing multiple time streams into a single location." The team huddled together, trying to formulate an escape plan. But planning became impossible because cause and effect had broken down. They would decide on a course of action, then realize they had already attempted it and failed, or succeeded, or were currently in the middle of attempting it in another version of themselves they could see 50 feet away. Brandon was on the radio, Travis recalled, trying to coordinate with us from the command center, but he was hearing our voices before we spoke. He'd ask us a question, and we'd hear his question after we'd already answered it. The conversation was happening backward and forward at the same time. It was Thomas Winterton, the ranch's superintendent, who finally noticed the pattern. The temporal distortions were strongest near a specific rock formation at the center of the shelf. Every time someone approached approached it, time became more unstable. Every time they moved away from it, things stabilized slightly. Thomas theorized that something was buried there, Travis said. Or maybe something was trying to come through. He described it as a weak point in space-time, a place where the membrane between moments had worn thin. Against Travis's objections, Dragon approached the rock formation with a handheld sensor. The readings went insane. Electromagnetic spikes, gravitational fluctuations, radiation signatures that didn't match any known isotope. And then Dragon disappeared. Not vanished in a flash of light, not pulled into another dimension. He simply stopped existing in that moment. One frame he was there, the next frame he wasn't, but his shadow remained, cast by a light source that no longer had an object to create it. "We could hear him," Travis said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dragon was screaming, but the sound was coming from every direction and no direction. It was like he'd been scattered across multiple points in time, and we were hearing all of his screams simultaneously. Then, impossibly, Dragon was back, standing exactly where he'd been, but changed. His hair was longer. His clothes were weathered, as if he'd been wearing them for weeks. His watch showed a date 3 months in the future. Dragon said he'd been gone for 47 days, Travis explained. He described living in a version of the ranch where the rest of us didn't exist, where he was completely alone, trapped in a loop where every day was the same day repeating. But for us, he'd been gone for maybe 3 seconds. Dragon had something in his hand when he reappeared, a small object he claimed he'd found buried near the rock formation. He described it as wrong, something that shouldn't exist in a linear timeline. When he tried to show it to the others, they couldn't focus on it. Their eyes slid off it, unable to perceive its shape. That's when Brandon Fugel made the call to evacuate immediately. The team grabbed what equipment they could and fled the shelf, not caring about the unstable terrain, just desperate to escape. They made it down in what felt like 10 minutes. When they checked their watches, 6 hours had passed. When they checked the camera timestamps, some showed they'd been gone for 14 hours. Others showed 23 minutes. But the worst discovery came when they reviewed the footage later that night. In the background of several shots, visible in the distance on the shelf they'd just evacuated, were human figures. The team counted carefully. There were 7 figures. The team had only consisted of 5 people. The 2 extra figures wore the same clothing as Travis and Dragon, but when the team froze the frame and zoomed in, the duplicates' faces were blurred, distorted, like reality couldn't decide what they should look like. "Those weren't us," Travis said flatly. "Or maybe they were us from a timeline where we didn't leave. Maybe they're still up there, trapped in that temporal loop. Maybe we are. Maybe the versions of us that came down aren't the originals. How would we even know?" That question, how would we even know, haunted the team for weeks. Travis began experiencing what he described as temporal echoes, memories of events that hadn't happened yet, or had happened in a slightly different way. He'd remember conversations with specific words that, when they actually occurred, had different words. He'd recall entire days that nobody else remembered. Dragon refused to talk about his 47 days alone, but his wife reported that he'd wake up screaming about the loop and the ones who didn't make it out. He lost weight, not from lack of eating, but as if his body was still living through those 47 days simultaneously, burning calories in a timeline that no longer existed. The object Dragon brought back from the shelf was confiscated by the Pentagon contractors within hours. Travis never saw it again, but he described it in his statement. It looked like a rock, but its surface moved, not like water or liquid, like time itself was flowing across it. When I tried to pick it up, my hand aged. The skin wrinkled, the veins became more prominent, my fingernails grew. When I pulled my hand away, it returned to normal. That object existed in multiple states of decay and formation simultaneously. The raw footage from that night was seized and classified. The Pentagon representatives reportedly told Brandon Fugel that the investigation had documented a temporal anomaly consistent with theoretical models of space-time collapse, and that public distribution could cause widespread temporal perception disorder. What does that mean? According to leaked documents, analysts who reviewed the footage began experiencing their own temporal distortions. One analyst reported remembering reviewing the footage before it had been delivered to them. Another claimed they watched the same footage on 3 consecutive days, and each time, the events in the video occurred in a different order. The footage itself became temporally unstable, Travis explained in his statement, as if whatever was happening on the shelf infected the recording. People who watched it weren't just seeing what happened. They were experiencing the temporal distortion secondhand. Their perception of time became unreliable. That's when the decision was made at the highest level. Episode 7 would never air. The footage would be locked in a classified facility. The investigation would be struck from all public records, but Travis believes it's too late for complete containment. "Something came back with us from the shelf," he said, his eyes darting to the side as if checking for something just out of frame. "I don't mean a creature or an entity. I mean a pattern, a temporal instability that's spreading. Sometimes I'll be talking to someone and they'll respond to something I haven't said yet. Sometimes I'll walk into a room I've never been in and know exactly where everything is because I've already been there in a future I haven't lived yet." He paused, swallowing hard. "And sometimes, late at night, I see him, the other Travis, the one who stayed on the shelf. He's standing in my backyard or at the end of the hallway or in the reflection of my car window. He looks older, tired, like he's been living all the timelines simultaneously while I've only been living one." Travis ended his statement with a warning. "We opened something at Skinwalker Ranch that we don't know how to close. The shelf is still there, still active, still collapsing timelines into itself. And I can't prove this, but I think that every timeline that collapses creates another duplicate, another version of the people who were there that night. And those duplicates have to exist somewhere." He leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "If you ever go to Skinwalker Ranch, stay away from the eastern shelf. Don't let them convince you to go up there, because if you do, you might come back, but you'll never be sure if you're the same you that went up. And the version of you that didn't make it out, it'll still be up there, living every possible timeline, watching every version of itself, unable to die because it's trapped in a loop where death itself just restarts the sequence." The interview ended there. The video was posted to a fringe paranormal website and removed within hours, but not before thousands of people downloaded it. In the comments, dozens of viewers reported the same experience. While watching Travis's statement, they felt like they'd already watched it before. They remembered details that hadn't happened yet in the video. They anticipated his words before he spoke them. One commenter wrote, "I watched this video 3 times, but I only clicked play once. I don't know how to explain that. I remember watching it, then watching it again, then watching it a 3rd time, but my browser history only shows 1 view. Did I watch it 3 times in 3 different timelines? Am I remembering futures that haven't happened yet?" Another simply wrote, "I saw myself in the background of the video, behind Travis, through the window, but I've never been to his location. I've never met him. How could I be in the background unless..." Travis hasn't appeared publicly since that statement. His social media went dark. The secret of Skinwalker Ranch continued without addressing the missing episode, and production moved all investigations away from the eastern portion of the property. But last week, a hiker in Utah, nearly 50 miles from Skinwalker Ranch, posted a photo to social media. In the distance, standing on a rocky shelf, were 7 human figures. The hiker claimed there was nobody else on the trail that day, but in the photo, the figures were clearly visible. When the image was analyzed, facial recognition software identified 5 of the figures: Travis Taylor, Dragon, Thomas Winterton, and 2 other team members from that night. The other 2 figures had faces too blurred to identify, but they wore the same clothing as Travis and Dragon. The hiker added one final detail. They weren't moving. They were just standing there, completely still, like they were waiting for something. Or like they were stuck. "I watched them for 10 minutes, and they didn't move once, not even to breathe." The question that haunts everyone who knows about Episode 7 is simple but terrifying. If the versions we see now, the Travis Taylor appearing on TV, the Dragon working security, the team continuing their investigations, are the ones who made it off the shelf, then who are the duplicates still standing there? And if we can't tell the difference, does it even matter? If this story disturbed you, subscribe and share this video. Let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced time anomalies or felt like you've lived the same moment twice. And if you ever find yourself at Skinwalker Ranch, remember Travis's warning. Some investigations aren't worth the answers. Because sometimes the truth isn't that you found something strange. It's that something strange found you and decided to keep you in every timeline forever. And sometimes the scariest question isn't what happened. It's which version of me came back. What you're about to hear changes everything we thought we knew about Skinwalker Ranch. For years, Dr. Travis Taylor, a man with multiple doctorates in aerospace engineering, optical science, and physics, has led the scientific investigation at America's most mysterious property. He's worked on classified government projects. He's investigated advanced propulsion systems for the Department of Defense. He's someone who demands proof, who insists on repeatability, who approaches every anomaly with rigorous skepticism. But something has shifted. In recent statements and on-camera moments from The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, Dr. Taylor has begun acknowledging something he spent years avoiding, something the data has forced him to accept. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't belief. This was evidence, cold and repeatable, pushing him toward a conclusion that even he finds disturbing. Within the scientific community, and among those who follow the investigation closely, the change in his language has been impossible to miss. He's no longer just documenting anomalies. He's no longer simply saying we need more data. He's acknowledging intelligence behind the phenomena, purpose, awareness, response. And for someone with his credentials, someone with everything to lose by making extraordinary claims, that acknowledgement represents a profound shift. Subscribe now, because what follows will challenge your understanding of what's possible at this 512-acre property in northeastern Utah. Let's establish exactly who Dr. Travis Taylor is, because without understanding his background, you can't fully appreciate the significance of what he's now saying. This isn't a paranormal enthusiast who finally found evidence for his beliefs. This isn't someone with a pre-existing agenda looking for validation. This is a scientist whose entire career has been built on skepticism and evidence-based analysis. Dr. Taylor holds a doctorate in optical science and engineering from the University of Alabama. He holds another doctorate in aerospace systems engineering. He has a master's degree in physics, another in astronomy, and another in mechanical and aerospace engineering. He's worked on advanced propulsion systems. He's contributed to missile defense programs. He's been involved in classified projects that required the highest security clearances. When History Channel brought him to Skinwalker Ranch, they needed someone who would push back against wild theories, someone who would demand scientific rigor, someone who would protect the integrity of the investigation even if it made for less dramatic television. And that's exactly what he did for years. He questioned everything. He insisted on controlled experiments. He looked for mundane explanations first: equipment malfunction, environmental factors, human error. He installed sophisticated monitoring equipment across the ranch, spectrum analyzers to detect electromagnetic frequencies, radiation detectors to measure energy signatures, high-speed cameras to capture phenomena too fast for the human eye, GPS sensors to track spatial anomalies. He approached every strange occurrence with the same skepticism he would apply to any scientific investigation. Watch the early seasons and you'll see him constantly pumping the brakes on speculation, suggesting conventional explanations, insisting on more data before drawing conclusions. So when someone like Travis Taylor, someone with everything to lose by making claims he can't back up, begins speaking more openly about encountering phenomena that challenge our understanding of physics, you have to ask yourself what exactly forced his hand. What data became so overwhelming that continuing to deny it would be intellectually dishonest? What patterns emerged that even the ultimate skeptic had to acknowledge? In the early seasons of The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, strange things happened, but they were isolated incidents, individual anomalies that, taken one at a time, could be explained away or filed under needs more investigation. A UAP sighting here, an electromagnetic spike there, equipment failure, unusual radiation readings. Each incident by itself had possible explanations. But science isn't about individual events. It's about patterns. It's about seeing the same thing happen multiple times under controlled conditions. It's about ruling out coincidence and finding genuine correlations. And that's when things at Skinwalker Ranch got disturbing, because the team began documenting recurring anomalies that weren't just random weirdness. UAP sightings weren't random. They appeared in specific locations at predictable intervals. They showed up during certain types of experiments. They manifested in response to specific stimuli. Electromagnetic field spikes correlated with GPS failures. Not sometimes, consistently. When they detected unusual EMF readings, their GPS systems would show impossible coordinates, positions that placed them hundreds of feet from where they were actually standing. Radiation bursts occurred in conjunction with visual phenomena. They'd see something unusual in the sky, and simultaneously their radiation detectors would spike. Equipment didn't just fail randomly. It failed when they were investigating specific areas of the ranch. Certain locations triggered consistent patterns of malfunction. Cameras would shut off, batteries would drain, electronics would reset. What started as unexplained events became repeatable phenomena. Data points aligned across time, location, and experimental conditions. The phenomena weren't just happening to them, they were happening in response to their investigations. When you drill in a certain area, radiation spikes. Every time. When you launch rockets towards certain coordinates, UAPs appear. When you use certain frequencies, equipment malfunctions, specific, predictable, repeatable patterns. Dr. Taylor couldn't ignore the correlation. When you see the same pattern emerge over and over, when you can predict outcomes based on inputs, when the relationship between action and response becomes statistically significant, you're no longer looking at coincidence. You're looking at a system with rules, a system that responds predictably to specific inputs. And that realization changed everything. There comes a moment in every scientific investigation when the data becomes undeniable, when you've exhausted every rational explanation, tested every mundane hypothesis, ruled out every conventional possibility. For Dr. Taylor and his team, that moment came during experiments where the readings exceeded not just their expectations but safe thresholds. They measured radiation levels that should not exist in that environment, not slightly elevated readings that might be explained by natural sources, massive spikes that had no conventional source, electromagnetic frequencies that don't match any known transmission, commercial, military, or natural, GPS coordinates shifting by hundreds of feet, while equipment remained completely stationary, energy signatures that violated our understanding of how physics should work in that space. Watch his reactions in recent seasons, the pauses before he speaks, the careful choice of words, the moments where he stops mid-sentence, processing what he's seeing, searching for a conventional explanation, and coming up empty. He doesn't say this is impossible. He says this shouldn't be happening. He doesn't say this violates the laws of physics. He says this is inconsistent with our current understanding. These distinctions matter. They're the words of a scientist who's seeing something that challenges conventional knowledge but who isn't ready to completely abandon the scientific framework, because what they were measuring shouldn't coexist. You can't have those radiation signatures without a source. You can't have those electromagnetic patterns without generation equipment. You can't have GPS anomalies of that magnitude without massive gravitational interference or sophisticated jamming. And yet there they were, documented, repeatable, undeniable, captured by multiple independent sensor systems. This wasn't one sensor giving a bad reading. They were seeing correlated anomalies across multiple sensor types. When the radiation spiked, the EMF detectors also showed unusual readings. When the GPS failed, they also saw visual phenomena, multiple independent systems detecting something at the same time. At this point, Skinwalker Ranch stopped behaving like a piece of land with unusual properties. It started behaving like a system with inputs and outputs, a system that responded to their actions, a system that seemed to follow rules, even if those rules didn't match anything in conventional physics, a system that, terrifyingly, seemed to be aware of what they were doing and responding to it. And this is where everything changes. In recent statements, Dr. Travis Taylor has made a fundamental shift in how he discusses the phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch. It's subtle. If you're not paying close attention, you might miss it. But for those who followed his journey, it's seismic. He no longer treats the phenomena as random environmental anomalies. He's not discussing unusual geological formations or atmospheric conditions. He no longer frames them as unexplained natural occurrences that science will eventually understand. Instead, Dr. Taylor now openly acknowledges that what they're dealing with exhibits signs of intelligence. Not consciousness necessarily, not sentience in the way we usually think about it, but intelligence, purpose, awareness, response. He talks about the phenomena responding to their experiments, not just happening during experiments, responding, as if whatever they're dealing with is aware of what they're doing and choosing how to react. He discusses patterns of behavior that suggest awareness, not just patterns in data, but patterns of behavior. That word choice is crucial. Rocks don't behave, energy doesn't behave, physical phenomena don't behave. Things with awareness, things with intelligence, things that can make choices, those things behave. He references reactions that appear deliberate, purposeful, as if whatever they're studying is trying to achieve specific outcomes. This is a massive departure from early seasons where every strange occurrence was met with, "We need more data," or "There must be a natural explanation." Now the data is the explanation, the patterns they've documented, the responses they've measured, the behaviors they've observed. That's what's explaining everything else. And if there's intelligence behind these phenomena, that means something is aware of their presence. Something knows they're there. Something is watching them investigate. And intelligence implies intent. If something is intelligent, if it's making choices about how to respond to their investigations, then it has reasons for those choices. It has purposes. It has goals, which means everything that's happened at Skinwalker Ranch might not be random. The equipment failures, the phenomena that appear and disappear, the patterns of activity they've documented, all of it might be intentional. But why here? Why this specific 512-acre property in northeastern Utah? The answer might lie in the geography itself. Skinwalker Ranch sits in a basin surrounded by mesas. Beneath the surface, ground-penetrating radar has revealed massive underground structures, cavities, tunnels, possibly even chambers that shouldn't exist in that geological formation. The ranch sits on what appears to be a unique convergence point, magnetic anomalies that don't match expected patterns, unusual mineral deposits that create natural waveguides for electromagnetic energy, geological features that might act as natural resonators or amplifiers, creating specific electromagnetic or gravitational properties. But here's what's what's truly unsettling. Similar phenomena have been reported at other locations around the world, other basins, other areas with unusual geology, other places with magnetic anomalies, but they're weaker, less consistent, less intense. Other sites show UAP activity, strange electromagnetic readings, but Skinwalker Ranch is different in both degree and kind. The concentration of activity is unprecedented. At other locations, you might see one type of phenomenon. At Skinwalker Ranch, you see all of it. UAPs, radiation spikes, electromagnetic anomalies, GPS failures, equipment malfunctions, physical effects on people and animals, all happening in the same location, sometimes simultaneously. The repeatability is disturbing. They can design experiments and predict with disturbing accuracy what's going to happen. It's as if Skinwalker Ranch isn't just a location where strange things happen. It's a hub, a focal point, a nexus. If other locations with similar phenomena are like small towns, Skinwalker Ranch is like a major metropolitan area. And that raises the most dangerous question yet. A hub for what? What kind of activity? What kind of intelligence? Serving what purpose? But investigating Skinwalker Ranch isn't just intellectually challenging, it's dangerous. Over the course of the investigation, team members have reported physical effects that can't be dismissed as coincidence. Burns with no apparent source, actual radiation burns that appear suddenly, sudden illness after exposure to certain areas, disorientation severe enough to require medical attention. Dr. Taylor himself has experienced health issues during investigations, headaches that appear suddenly when in certain areas, feelings of pressure or disorientation, physical symptoms that correlate with specific experimental activities. Other team members have been hospitalized. Some have developed symptoms that medical professionals struggle to explain, conditions that don't match known illnesses or injuries. And Dr. Taylor now openly acknowledges what he once downplayed. There are real safety concerns at Skinwalker Ranch. He talks about implementing new protocols, formal procedures for limiting exposure to certain areas, requirements for protective equipment, rules about how long team members can work in specific zones, mandatory medical monitoring. Because here's the terrifying implication. If the phenomena exhibit intelligence, and if that intelligence has demonstrated the ability to affect physical matter and biological systems, then studying it too closely might not just reveal answers, it might provoke a response. What happens when observation itself becomes a trigger? When your very presence, your equipment, your experiments provoke responses that can harm you. So why is Dr. Travis Taylor speaking more openly now? After years of careful language and measured responses, why this shift? The answer is simple. The evidence left no room for silence. When the data becomes overwhelming, when the patterns become undeniable, when the phenomena become too consistent to ignore, continuing to deflect becomes intellectually dishonest. Dr. Taylor has always balanced two competing forces, the scientific responsibility to report what you observe and the fear of being misinterpreted or sensationalized. For years, he erred on the side of caution. Better to say nothing than to say something that might be misunderstood. But there comes a point where staying silent does more harm than speaking up, where the integrity of the investigation demands transparency. The mounting evidence, season after season, experiment after experiment, has created a body of work that can no longer be explained away. They have the data, years of it, terabytes of measurements, observations under controlled conditions, repeated experiments with consistent results. At some point, we need more data stops being scientific caution and becomes avoidance. At some point, you have to acknowledge what the data is telling you. But here's what's really unsettling. If this is only what Dr. Taylor is willing to say publicly, on camera, in a format that will be broadcast to millions of people, what has he seen that he still can't talk about? What data exists that's even more disturbing? Because make no mistake, what he's saying publicly represents the minimum that intellectual honesty allows him to acknowledge. So what happens next? If Dr. Taylor's acknowledgement represents a turning point, what does that mean for the ongoing investigation? First, understand that the investigation is escalating. New protocols are being implemented. More sophisticated equipment is being deployed. The team is approaching the ranch with a level of seriousness that goes beyond scientific curiosity. Because here's the shift that's occurred. This is no longer about understanding the phenomena. It's about containment. Containment means you're dealing with something potentially dangerous, something that needs to be controlled, managed, kept from spreading or escalating. Dr. Taylor's shift in language reflects this. He's moved from curiosity-driven investigation to risk assessment mode. He talks about managing the phenomena rather than simply documenting it. When a scientist stops trying to reveal something and starts trying to contain it, that tells you everything about how dangerous they believe it to be. You don't contain things that are merely interesting. You contain things that pose risks. And here's another disturbing possibility. The ranch may not be trying to reveal its secrets. It may be testing boundaries, testing what the team will tolerate, testing how far it can push, testing whether they'll continue investigating despite the risks. If the phenomena are intelligent and purposeful, then this makes sense. You don't just passively allow yourself to be studied, you study back. Dr. Travis Taylor entered Skinwalker Ranch as a skeptic, a scientist determined to apply rigorous methodology to extraordinary claims, someone who would demand proof before accepting the impossible. And for years he maintained that skepticism. He pushed back, he questioned, he demanded repeatability. But now he's acknowledging intelligence behind the phenomena. He's talking about responses, patterns, and behaviors that suggest awareness. He's implementing safety protocols not for natural disasters, but for something that reacts to human presence. This isn't belief, this isn't faith, this isn't speculation, this is forced acknowledgement. Dr. Travis Taylor didn't want this conclusion. He didn't set out to prove the paranormal. He went to Skinwalker Ranch to debunk it, but the data wouldn't let him. The patterns wouldn't stop forming. The phenomena wouldn't stop responding. The evidence wouldn't stop accumulating, until he reached a point where continuing to deny it would be intellectually dishonest. So here's the final chilling thought. If the phenomenon at Skinwalker Ranch is intelligent, if it responds to investigation, if it exhibits patterns that suggest awareness, then it knows we're watching. It knows every experiment they run, every sensor they place, every measurement they take. It's aware of their presence, their activities, their attempts to understand it. And it always has, from the very first moment they set foot on that ranch, from the first sensor they installed, from the first experiment they conducted. It was aware, watching, waiting, which means that everything that's happened, every anomaly, every equipment failure, every injury, every phenomenon they've documented might not be random occurrence. It might all be intentional, chosen, deliberate, responses from something that knows it's being studied and has decided how to react to that study. And that raises the most disturbing question of all. If it's been aware of them this entire time, if it's been choosing how to respond to their investigations, if everything they've experienced has been intentional, what is it trying to tell them? Or perhaps more terrifyingly, what is it trying to prevent them from discovering? Joe Rogan sat in a darkened room watching footage that shouldn't exist. An orb, glowing, pulsing, moving through a house with what looked like intention, purpose, intelligence. When the video ended, Rogan, a man who's interviewed killers and conspiracy theorists without flinching, looked genuinely shaken. And then they told him something that made it worse. You can't unsee this. Once you know what's out there, once you understand what's happening at Skinwalker Ranch, the fear never really goes away. This is the story of what Joe Rogan experienced at America's most paranormally active location, the footage they showed him, the witnesses who changed his perspective, and why a man known for fearless skepticism admitted that Skinwalker Ranch tapped into something he's been terrified of since childhood. Subscribe now, because what we're about to reveal will change how you think about what's possible in our reality. Joe Rogan isn't someone you'd expect to be afraid of the paranormal. He's a UFC commentator who's watched men get knocked unconscious in brutal fashion, a comedian who's performed in front of hostile crowds, a podcast host who's sat across from serial killers, cartel members, and people describing the darkest aspects of human nature. Fear, in the traditional sense, isn't something Rogan displays publicly, but Rogan has admitted in multiple podcast episodes that the paranormal terrifies him. Not in an abstract intellectual way, but in a deep, primal, childhood-level fear that he's carried his entire life. Ghosts, unexplained phenomena, the idea that reality might contain things that violate our understanding of how the world works. These concepts have always unsettled him in ways that physical danger never has, which makes his decision to engage with Skinwalker Ranch all the more significant. Rogan has described it as deliberately confronting something he was subconsciously terrified of, like exposure therapy for a fear he'd never fully acknowledged. He wanted to face it, understand it, maybe prove to himself that there were rational explanations for the phenomena people reported. But what he found at Skinwalker Ranch, and what he learned from the people who'd experienced it firsthand, didn't provide the rational explanations he was hoping for. Instead, it confirmed his deepest fear, that there are things in our world that don't follow the rules we've established, things that are intelligent, aware, and possibly hostile. And once you know they exist, once you've seen the evidence, you can't unknow it. The fact that someone with Rogan's public persona, tough, skeptical, grounded in physical reality, could be genuinely shaken by Skinwalker Ranch says something profound about the place. Because if Rogan, who approaches most conspiracy theories and paranormal claims with healthy skepticism, walks away from Skinwalker Ranch disturbed, then maybe the stories about that remote Utah property deserve more serious consideration than most people give them. Skinwalker Ranch is a 512-acre property in northeastern Utah that has become synonymous with high strangeness: UFO sighting, mysterious orbs of light, cattle mutilations that defy conventional explanation, poltergeist-like activity, strange creatures that don't match any known wildlife, electronic equipment that fails in specific areas of the property, and witnesses, credible witnesses, who report experiences that sound impossible. The name itself comes from Navajo legend. Skinwalkers are shape-shifting witches in indigenous mythology, malevolent beings who can take the form of animals and inflict harm through supernatural means. The Navajo people traditionally don't speak about skinwalkers lightly. The very mention of them is considered dangerous, an invitation for negative spiritual forces. That this ranch carries that name tells you something about its reputation among people who've lived in the region for generations. But Skinwalker Ranch isn't just Native American folklore. Modern investigations have documented phenomena that seem to blend ancient mythology with contemporary, unexplained events. The ranch has been studied by scientists, investigated by government agencies, and featured in mainstream media. It's owned by Brandon Fugel, a real estate mogul who's invested millions in scientific instrumentation to document whatever is happening there. The property's history of high strangeness goes back decades, but it became widely known in the 1990s when the Sherman family purchased it and began experiencing phenomena so intense they eventually fled. UFOs that would hover silently over the property, strange lights that moved with apparent intelligence, cattle found mutilated with surgical precision, organs removed, blood completely drained, no tracks or evidence of predators anywhere near the carcasses. But what terrified the Sherman family most wasn't the individual incidents. It was the sense that something was aware of them, watching them, interacting with them in ways that felt deliberate and targeted. Objects would move, electronics would fail, voices would be heard in the sky speaking in languages they didn't recognize, and perhaps most disturbing, massive wolf-like creatures that seemed impervious to bullets would appear and vanish. The family reported sleeping together on the floor of their living room because they were too terrified to be separated. Imagine that. A ranching family, people who make their living off the land, who understand wildlife and natural phenomena, so frightened by what was happening on their property that they couldn't function normally. That level of sustained fear drove them to sell the ranch and never speak publicly about their experiences for years. This is the place Joe Rogan engaged with. Not a campfire story location, not a tourist attraction trading on vague legends. A property with documented history of phenomena that have terrified multiple families, stumped scientists, and resisted every attempt at rational explanation. And what Rogan learned about Skinwalker Ranch, particularly what he saw in that footage, would fundamentally change his relationship with the paranormal. One of the most consistent phenomena reported at Skinwalker Ranch involves orbs, not vague lights in the distance that could be misidentified aircraft or atmospheric phenomena. Distinct glowing spheres that move with apparent purpose, respond to human presence, and behave in ways that suggest intelligence rather than natural occurrence. Joe Rogan has spoken extensively about an encounter story that particularly affected him. A blue-collar witness, someone Rogan described as completely credible and grounded, reported that a small orb entered his house, not through a window or door, through the wall. It moved through the interior of his home, seeming to examine things, and at one point appeared to communicate with him, not verbally, but through behavior that suggested awareness and intention. What made this account compelling to Rogan wasn't just the description, it was the witness himself. This wasn't someone making wild claims about aliens or government conspiracy. This was a regular person describing a single, specific experience that had profoundly disturbed him. No embellish, no attempts to connect it to larger theories, just a straightforward account of something impossible that had happened in his home. But the orb phenomenon isn't isolated to one witness. Rogan also described seeing what he called a pristine photograph of an orb from another witness at a Skinwalker Ranch event. The image was clear enough to show details. The orb wasn't a blur or a light artifact. It was a distinct object captured in what appeared to be a structured, almost solid form. The photograph had been analyzed and couldn't be easily dismissed as lens flare, reflection, or digital artifact. This pattern, multiple credible witnesses reporting similar phenomena, is what elevates Skinwalker Ranch from folklore to something that demands serious investigation. When one person reports seeing orbs, you can dismiss it. When dozens of people, over decades, describe the same type of phenomena with remarkable consistency, you have to start asking harder questions about what's actually happening. The orbs represent something particularly unsettling about Skinwalker Ranch. They're not passive phenomena. They don't just appear and disappear randomly. According to multiple witnesses, they seem to interact. They approach people, they enter buildings, they respond to human presence and behavior. That suggests intelligence, and intelligence in something that violates our understanding of physics creates a category of fear that's different from simple startle responses or danger avoidance. When Rogan talks about the orbs, you can hear the tension in his voice. This isn't entertainment for him. It's not a fun mystery to speculate about. It's something that challenges his worldview in a fundamental way. Because if the orbs are real, if they're actually intelligent and interactive, then what are they? Where do they come from? And what do they want? There's footage from Skinwalker Ranch that the public hasn't seen, not because it's being suppressed by government agencies or hidden for nefarious reasons, but because the people who have it recognize that showing it widely would create a type of fear that's difficult to contain. The fear of knowing. The fear that comes from understanding that reality is fundamentally different from what we've been told. Joe Rogan was shown some of this footage in private screening, away from cameras, away from the public format of his podcast. The people running investigations at Skinwalker Ranch, serious scientists and researchers, sat him down and showed him documentation of phenomena that they couldn't explain through conventional means. The footage included those orbs, not distant lights, close-up documentation of objects moving through space in ways that defy known physics, sudden acceleration, 90-degree turns at speeds that would destroy any physical craft, movement through solid objects, and perhaps most disturbing, behavior that suggested awareness of being filmed, as if the orbs knew they were being documented and either didn't care or wanted to be seen. But, according to accounts, there was other footage as well. Unexplained figures captured on thermal imaging, heat signatures that appeared and vanished without corresponding physical presence, audio recordings of voices speaking in frequencies and patterns that didn't match human speech or any known animal vocalizations, electronic equipment failures that happened in sequence, as if something was deliberately shutting down instrumentation. What made the footage particularly disturbing wasn't just what it showed, but what it implied. This wasn't random. The phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch appeared to be intelligent, purposeful, and in some cases targeted at specific individuals. People who spent time on the property reported that the activity seemed to follow them. Equipment would fail when they approached certain areas. Phenomena would increase in frequency when particular researchers were present. This is what creates the fear of knowing. It's one thing to hear stories about paranormal activity. It's another to see documented evidence that something is happening that science can't explain. And it's something else entirely to understand that this thing, whatever it is, might be aware of you, might be interacting with you, might have intentions that you can't predict or understand. Rogan has described his reaction to the footage as a mix of fascination and deep unease. Part of him wanted to see more, to understand what was happening. But another part recognized that each new piece of evidence made it harder to maintain comfortable skepticism. The more he learned about Skinwalker Ranch, the less he could dismiss it. And that loss of ability to dismiss creates its own kind of existential fear. The people who showed Rogan the footage told him something important. You can't unsee this. Once you've watched this evidence, once you've understood what it represents, your relationship with reality changes. You start wondering what else is out there that we don't understand. What else is interacting with our world that we've dismissed or ignored, and that wondering, that uncertainty about the fundamental nature of reality creates a fear that never fully goes away. What separates Skinwalker Ranch from other allegedly haunted or paranormally active locations is the consistent reporting of intelligent behavior. This isn't random poltergeist activity. It's not vague feelings or ambiguous experiences. Multiple witnesses, over decades, describe phenomena that appears to think, plan, and respond to human presence with what can only be called strategic awareness. Objects move in ways that suggest deliberate interaction. Electronics drain at times that seem calculated to create maximum inconvenience or fear. The orbs appear when specific people are present, as if targeting individuals for observation. Cattle mutilations happen in patterns that defy random predator behavior, with surgical precision that suggests tools and intelligence rather than animal attacks. Families who've lived on the ranch report experiences that feel personal. Not just strange events happening around them, but events that seem designed to affect them specifically. Voices speaking their names, objects significant to them being moved or manipulated, activity that increases when they try to investigate or decreases when they try to ignore it. This adaptive, responsive behavior creates a psychological impact that goes beyond simple fear. Joe Rogan has spoken about this aspect of Skinwalker Ranch with particular concern. The idea that something is toying with people, playing with them, creating fear not through direct direct harm, but through psychological manipulation and demonstration of capabilities that shouldn't exist. That's the kind of intelligence that terrifies in a unique way, because you can't predict it, can't prepare for it, and can't escape the sense that you're being observed and evaluated. Scientific teams investigating the ranch have documented this intelligent behavior through controlled experiments. They'll set up equipment in specific patterns and watch as phenomena seems to avoid the instrumentation. They'll create protocols to capture evidence and observe the activity changing in response, as if whatever is there understands what they're trying to do and either evades documentation or deliberately provides evidence in ways that create more questions than answers. This intelligence factor is what makes Skinwalker Ranch different from UFO sightings or ghost stories. UFOs could be misidentified aircraft or atmospheric phenomena. Ghosts could be psychological projection or environmental factors. But the pattern of intelligent, targeted, adaptive behavior at Skinwalker Ranch resists those comfortable explanations. Something there is thinking, and that something appears to be aware of the humans trying to understand it. For someone like Rogan, who values rational thought and evidence-based understanding, this creates profound cognitive dissonance. How do you rationally explain intelligence that exists outside known biological frameworks? How do you study something that appears to study you back? How do you investigate phenomena that seem to understand and respond to your investigation methods? Joe Rogan has interviewed thousands of people over his career. He's developed a sense for when someone is lying, exaggerating, or misremembering. He knows the difference between a person telling the truth as they understand it versus someone creating a story for attention. And his encounters with Skinwalker Ranch witnesses convinced him that something genuine was happening, even if he couldn't fully explain what. The blue-collar witness he's referenced multiple times stood out specifically because of his credibility. This wasn't someone seeking fame or promoting a book. He wasn't making wild claims about alien civilizations or government conspiracies. He simply described a single, specific experience, the orb entering his house, with the kind of detail and emotional resonance that suggested genuine trauma and confusion. What particularly affected Rogan was that this witness had no framework for understanding what happened to him. He wasn't a paranormal enthusiast with ready-made explanations. He was a regular person who'd experienced something impossible and was still trying to process it. That confusion, that genuine bewilderment is harder to fake than certainty, and it made his account more compelling than elaborate theories from self-proclaimed experts. Rogan has also spoken about meeting multiple witnesses who reported similar experiences without having contact with each other. The pattern matching across independent accounts is significant. When people who don't know each other describe the same types of phenomena in the same locations with consistent details, it becomes much harder to dismiss as individual delusion or attention-seeking. The scientists and researchers working at Skinwalker Ranch also impressed Rogan with their credibility. These weren't fringe figures or UFO enthusiasts. They were credentialed professionals, some with backgrounds in physics, engineering, and aerospace, who approached the investigation with genuine skepticism and rigorous methodology. The fact that they were documenting phenomena they couldn't explain carried weight specifically because they were trying hard to explain it through conventional means. What shifted Rogan's perspective wasn't any single piece of evidence or testimony. It was the cumulative weight of multiple credible witnesses, sophisticated documentation, and his own emotional response to engaging with the material. He wanted to remain skeptical. He tried to find conventional explanations, but the combination of witness credibility and documented evidence made comfortable dismissal impossible. This is perhaps the most important aspect of Rogan's Skinwalker Ranch experience. He didn't become a true believer. He didn't abandon skepticism or start accepting every paranormal claim uncritically, but he acknowledged that Skinwalker Ranch presented evidence and testimony that he couldn't easily explain away. And that acknowledgement from someone with his platform and credibility matters significantly to how seriously people take the phenomena. There's a concept in psychology called the knowledge burden. Once you know something, once you've seen evidence that fundamentally challenges your understanding of reality, you can't unknow it. You can try to rationalize it away, find alternative explanations, or simply avoid thinking about it. But the knowledge remains, creating a low-level anxiety that colors how you perceive the world. Joe Rogan has spoken about how engaging with Skinwalker Ranch created this burden for him. Before, the paranormal was something he could be afraid of in an abstract way. Ghost stories were entertainment. UFO sightings were interesting speculation. But after seeing the footage, meeting the witnesses, and confronting the evidence directly, the paranormal became real in a way that changed his relationship with reality itself. The fear he describes isn't about immediate danger. It's not the fear of being attacked or physically harmed. It's the existential fear that comes from understanding that reality contains things we don't comprehend, that there might be intelligent forces operating operating around us that we can't see, predict, or control. That the comfortable assumption that we understand how the world works might be fundamentally wrong. This is why the people who showed Rogan the footage warned him about seeing it. Not because the images themselves are traumatic in a traditional sense, but because they create a shift in perspective that's difficult to reverse. Once you've seen documentation of phenomena that violates known physics, once you've understood that credible witnesses and sophisticated instruments are capturing evidence of something impossible, you can't go back to comfortable certainty about reality. Rogan has admitted that Skinwalker Ranch got into his head in ways that other intense experiences haven't. He's interviewed war veterans describing combat trauma. He's talked to survivors of horrible crimes. He's discussed death, violence, and human suffering extensively. But the fear created by Skinwalker Ranch is different because it's not about things humans do to each other. It's about the possibility that we're not alone in reality, and that what shares reality with us might be beyond our ability to understand or interact with safely. This fear manifests in subtle ways. Rogan has mentioned being more aware of unexplained phenomena after Skinwalker Ranch, more attentive to things that don't quite make sense, more willing to consider that strange experiences people report might have validity. It's not that he became credulous or started believing every paranormal claim, but he lost the ability to dismiss things automatically, and that loss of automatic dismissal creates ongoing uncertainty. The knowledge burden extends to sharing information. Rogan has been relatively careful about discussing specific details of what he saw in that footage. He references, he acknowledges it affected him, but he doesn't describe it in explicit detail. That restraint suggests recognition that spreading detailed information about phenomena this unsettling might create the same knowledge burden in others. Some things, once known, create fear that can't be easily managed. If even a fraction of what's reported at Skinwalker Ranch is accurate, the implications extend far beyond one property in Utah. The existence of intelligent, interactive phenomena that operate outside known physical laws would require fundamental revisions to our understanding of reality. Not just scientific theories, but philosophical, spiritual, and practical frameworks for understanding our place in the universe. Joe Rogan understands these implications, which is part of why Skinwalker Ranch affected him so profoundly. If the orbs are real and intelligent, what are they? Are they technological, suggesting advanced civilizations with capabilities we can't comprehend? Are they biological, implying life forms that evolved along completely different lines than anything we know? Are they something else entirely? Entities that exist in dimensions or states we don't have concepts for? The targeted intelligent behavior reported at Skinwalker Ranch also raises disturbing questions about intent. If these phenomena are aware of humans and capable of interaction, what do they want? The activity seems designed to create fear and confusion rather than communication or harm. It's psychological rather than physical. What kind of intelligence invests effort in toying with humans without clear purpose or outcome? There's also the question of scope. If Skinwalker Ranch is experiencing this level of activity, what's happening in other locations that aren't being studied as intensively? Are there phenomena occurring globally that we're missing because we're not looking, or because we've culturally conditioned ourselves to dismiss reports as delusion or lies? How much of our reality is shaped by things we don't acknowledge or understand? For Rogan, these questions connect to larger themes he explores on his podcast: the limits of human knowledge, the possibility of non-human intelligence, the relationship between consciousness and reality. Skinwalker Ranch provides a concrete case study where these abstract questions become tangible. The phenomena there demands explanation, but resists every conventional framework we try to apply. The knowledge that something like Skinwalker Ranch exists, that intelligent phenomena are documented and studied but remain unexplained, creates a specific kind of cognitive burden. We live in a world where we assume science will eventually explain everything, where the unexplained is simply the not yet explained. But Skinwalker Ranch suggests that maybe some phenomena will resist explanation indefinitely, not because our methods are inadequate, but because the phenomena themselves exist outside the boundaries of what our current frameworks can address. In 2007, the Defense Intelligence Agency sent a senior scientist to Skinwalker Ranch expecting a routine assessment. What he witnessed that night triggered a secret $22 million Pentagon investigation that stayed hidden for years. But the most disturbing part wasn't what happened on the ranch. It's what followed investigators home. Lights, knocks, pressure changes, even inside their children's bedrooms. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the government classified nearly everything it learned, and why some who stepped onto that land say the investigation never really ended. If you want the stories they tried to bury, subscribe now, because what comes next changes everything. James Lakatsky was not sent to Skinwalker Ranch because anyone at the Pentagon believed in paranormal stories. He was sent because the Defense Intelligence Agency needed a professional skeptic, someone trained to dismantle extraordinary claims, not endorse them. With a doctorate in physics and decades spent evaluating advanced aerospace threats, Lakatsky's job was simple: determine whether the reports coming out of a remote Utah ranch were meaningless noise or something that justified concern. From the DIA's perspective, this was supposed to be routine. Review the site, interview witnesses, inspect the equipment, and close the file. Ranchers had claimed strange things before, so had pilots, soldiers, and civilians all over the world. Most cases collapsed under scrutiny. This one was expected to do the same. When Lakatsky arrived in July of 2007, he was accompanied by security personnel and representatives connected to the property's owner, Robert Bigelow. Bigelow had already spent years and millions of dollars documenting unusual activity on the ranch using scientific instruments rather than anecdotes. Infrared cameras, electromagnetic sensors, radiation detectors, and environmental monitors were already running when Lakatsky stepped onto the land. Nothing was being hidden. Everything was being recorded. The visit was scheduled to last only a few hours, but as daylight faded, Bigelow's team suggested staying through the evening. According to them, the activity intensified after dark. Lakatsky agreed, not because he believed the claims, but because dismissing them without direct observation would have been sloppy science. Shortly after nightfall, while standing near one of the ranch's central structures, Lakatsky witnessed something he later admitted he could not explain. A three-dimensional tunnel of light appeared in front of him. Not a beam, not a reflection, but a solid-looking structure suspended in open air. It glowed yellow-white, extended horizontally, and vanished just as suddenly as it appeared. The event lasted less than half a minute. What made the moment impossible to ignore wasn't just what Lakatsky saw. It was what happened simultaneously across the monitoring systems. Electromagnetic fields spiked. Radiation sensors registered brief anomalies. Temperature readings dropped in a localized area around the phenomenon. Independent instruments, calibrated separately, all reacted at the same moment. For a scientist trained to identify equipment failure and coincidence, that convergence was alarming. Lakatsky spent the rest of the night reviewing the data and questioning the research team. By morning, he no longer viewed the ranch as a curiosity. He viewed it as an active anomaly. And before leaving Utah, he heard something even more troubling. Multiple researchers claimed that after working on the ranch, the phenomena didn't stay behind. It followed them home. When James Lakatsky returned to Washington after his visit to Skinwalker Ranch, his briefing did not sound like anything the Defense Intelligence Agency was accustomed to hearing. He didn't describe folklore, mass hysteria, or unreliable witnesses. He described synchronized sensor anomalies, multiple trained observers witnessing the same event, and data that could not be dismissed as equipment failure. His conclusion was direct and unsettling. Whatever was happening at the ranch was real, measurable, and potentially important enough to justify further investigation. Within months, the Pentagon quietly authorized a classified research effort known as the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or AAWSAP. On paper, the program sounded harmless, a study into future aerospace threats and breakthrough technologies. In reality, its central focus was understanding the phenomena observed at Skinwalker Ranch and determining whether similar events were occurring elsewhere. The budget was $22 million, spread across roughly 2 years, and almost no one outside a small circle of officials even knew it existed. The contract was awarded to a research group connected to ranch owner Robert Bigelow, a decision that would later raise eyebrows. But from the government's perspective, the choice was practical. Bigelow's team already had years of documentation, active monitoring systems, and direct access to the only known site where the phenomena could be observed repeatedly. Starting over would have meant losing time and whatever opportunity the ranch represented. Once AAWSAP formally launched, Skinwalker Ranch was transformed from private property into something closer to a restricted research installation. Additional sensors were installed, security protocols tightened, scientists, engineers, and intelligence analysts rotated through the site in controlled shifts. Every event was logged, every reading was cross-checked, environmental baselines were established so natural explanations could be ruled out before anything was labeled anomalous. The goal was not to prove the paranormal, it It was to eliminate every conventional explanation until nothing remained. And over time, that's exactly what began to happen. The phenomena did not behave like weather, geology, or electromagnetic interference. It appeared sporadically, responded to observation, and refused to repeat itself under identical conditions. Some nights were quiet, others produced events that triggered multiple sensors at once. Even more troubling, AAWSAP investigators began confirming reports that Bigelow's team had quietly documented for years. The effects didn't end when researchers left the ranch. Personnel who spent time on the property began reporting strange disturbances back home, sometimes days or weeks later. The pattern was consistent enough that program leadership could no longer ignore it. By the end of its first year, AAWSAP had reached a disturbing realization. Skinwalker Ranch wasn't just a place where anomalies happened. It was something that initiated contact, and that contact didn't stop when the investigation did. The moment AAWSAP personnel began rotating through Skinwalker Ranch, a troubling pattern resurfaced, one that Robert Bigelow had quietly warned about years earlier. The phenomena did not remain confined to the property. Instead, it appeared to attach itself to people who spent time there, following them back into their private lives long after they had left Utah. The first confirmed off-site incidents came from trained investigators who understood how easily coincidence and misinterpretation could distort perception. These were not casual reports. They were documented, repeated, and in some cases, measured. One researcher reported that within 24 hours of returning home, he began hearing sharp knocks coming from inside the walls of his house. The pattern was unmistakable. 2 quick impacts, a pause, followed by a heavier third strike. It was identical to a knocking sequence he had personally recorded while working at the ranch. Environmental checks found no explanation. No pipes, no HVAC systems, no structural weaknesses. Contractors confirmed the house could not physically produce sounds with that force or rhythm. Yet the knocks continued, sometimes occurring several times in a single day, sometimes disappearing for days before returning without warning. The timing matched nothing natural. More disturbing were reports involving family members who had no knowledge of Skinwalker Ranch or the investigation. Several AAWSAP personnel described their children seeing brief flashes of movement, shadow-like shapes, or unexplained lights inside their bedrooms. Others reported sudden drops in temperature localized to specific rooms, or pressure changes strong enough to make ears pop, as if altitude were shifting indoors. These accounts emerged independently from families living in different states, in homes with no shared construction or environmental factors. One DIA analyst who spent less than a single workday on the ranch experienced some of the most severe effects. Within a week of returning home, motion sensors inside his house began triggering without cause. His children described lights moving through rooms when electronics were unplugged. His spouse, who knew nothing about his assignment, independently reported strange sensations and sounds that mirrored reports coming from other investigators' homes. What alarmed AAWSAP leadership was not just the events themselves, but their unpredictability. Time spent at the ranch did not correlate with severity. Some personnel worked there for weeks and reported nothing. Others experienced immediate and intense disturbances after only brief exposure. There was no way to predict who would be affected, when it would begin, or how long it would last. As interviews expanded, even individuals who initially denied experiencing anything unusual began recalling small anomalies they had dismissed. Doors left open, electronics activating on their own, fleeting visual distortions. Once those moments were documented and compared, the pattern became undeniable. Skinwalker Ranch was no longer just a research site. It appeared to be a point of initiation, a place where contact began but did not end. And that realization forced investigators to confront a far more dangerous possibility. This was not a localized phenomena. It was something that traveled with people, crossing state lines, families, and private homes without permission. Once AAWSAP investigators accepted that passive observation was no longer enough, the focus of the Skinwalker Ranch study shifted. If the phenomenon appeared to react to human presence, then controlled interaction might reveal how it operates. The team began designing experiments meant to eliminate coincidence, contamination, and human interference entirely. What followed pushed the investigation beyond anything normally associated with anomaly research. One of the most significant tests involved a sealed environment experiment inside a secured trailer. Researchers placed a small table at the center of the trailer and scattered children's jacks and a rubber ball across its surface. The setup was deliberately simple. The trailer was sealed with tamper-evident locks, monitored by motion sensors, and filmed continuously by cameras placed both inside and outside the structure. Environmental conditions were logged down to minor fluctuations. There was no physical way for anyone to enter, touch the objects, or manipulate the scene without being detected. When the team returned hours later, the scene inside the trailer had changed. The jacks, which had been randomly scattered, were now grouped neatly by color into organized rows. The ball had rolled from one end of the table to the other. No alarms had triggered. No seals were broken. The air pressure, temperature, and humidity remained stable throughout the test period. The cameras showed no visible intrusion and no movement that could account for the rearrangement. The experiment was repeated with stricter controls and additional monitoring. Sometimes the objects moved. Other times, nothing happened at all. The phenomenon appeared selective, refusing to perform on demand. That inconsistency became just as important as the successful trials. Random environmental forces do not choose when to act. Other experiments produced similarly unsettling results. Sudden flashes of light appeared in sealed rooms, often disabling cameras immediately after recording them. Narrow bands of freezing air moved through enclosed spaces with surgical precision, unaffected by ventilation or airflow. Electromagnetic spikes occurred only while measurements were actively being taken, then vanished the moment equipment was powered down. The conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever was interacting with the researchers was not passive. It responded to observation, adjusted its behavior, and avoided capture. Skinwalker Ranch was no longer behaving like a natural anomaly. It was behaving like something that knew it was being studied and did not want to be understood. As AAWSAP continued documenting events at Skinwalker Ranch, the investigation quietly crossed a line inside the Pentagon. What began as an attempt to understand unexplained phenomena was now raising questions that went far beyond science. The issue was no longer what the phenomenon was, it was what it could do and whether it posed a threat that existing security systems were never designed to handle. From a defense perspective, the most alarming development was the off-site activity. If something encountered at Skinwalker Ranch could follow investigators home and manifest inside private residences, then distance offered no protection. Several AAWSAP personnel held high-level security clearances and routinely worked inside classified environments. The obvious question emerged: if the phenomenon could appear in a suburban home, what prevented it from appearing inside a secure facility? That possibility forced leadership to consider scenarios no intelligence framework could comfortably address. If the activity represented an advanced surveillance system, one capable of tracking individuals across state lines without electronics, signals, or physical devices, it would surpass any known human technology. If a foreign adversary possessed such a capability, it would represent a catastrophic intelligence failure. Russia and China were quietly evaluated as hypothetical sources, but the theory quickly unraveled. The phenomenon had been reported in the Uinta Basin for decades, long before modern aerospace or surveillance breakthroughs were possible. That left a more unsettling explanation. The phenomenon might not be human at all. This hypothesis was deeply uncomfortable for officials, but increasingly difficult to dismiss. The behavior documented by AAWSAP showed awareness, responsiveness, and selectivity. It reacted to observation. It adapted when experiments changed. It targeted individuals rather than locations. These were not traits of weather systems, geological activity, or electromagnetic interference. They were traits associated with intelligence. Briefings prepared for senior officials emphasized the same conclusions again and again. The phenomena was real. It was measurable. It exceeded known technological capabilities, and its origin and intent were unknown. Worse still, it demonstrated the ability to interact with human environments in ways that bypassed physical security entirely. AAWSAP leadership warned that continuing the investigation carried risks that could not be quantified. Personnel were reporting psychological stress. Families were being affected. There were no protocols for protecting people once exposure occurred. Participation in the program meant accepting unknown long-term consequences, something no agency could ethically mandate. At that point, Skinwalker Ranch stopped being a scientific mystery. It became a liability. The Pentagon now faced an impossible dilemma: ignore the phenomenon and risk missing a genuine threat, or continue investigating and expose more people to something they could not control, predict, or contain. And that dilemma would soon shape a decision that permanently changed the course of the program. By 2010, AWSAP had reached a point the Pentagon was not prepared to handle. The program had produced years of data, witness testimony, and experimental results that pointed to something genuinely anomalous, but none of it fit neatly into existing military or intelligence frameworks. The investigation wasn't yielding a weapon, a countermeasure, or a clear technological breakthrough. Instead, it was producing questions that senior leadership had no way to answer, much less explain to Congress. Officially, AAWSAP ended because of budget constraints and shifting priorities. That explanation was technically true, but deeply incomplete. Inside the Defense Intelligence Agency, the program had become increasingly difficult to justify. Briefings to senior officials were uncomfortable. Analysts struggled to condense findings into slides that wouldn't sound absurd to decision-makers unfamiliar with the data. Describing a phenomenon that reacted to observation, followed people home, and avoided detection did not translate into actionable intelligence. Oversight pressure also mounted. Congressional staff began asking where the money was going and what measurable outcomes the program had produced. AAWSAP's defenders argued that identifying unknown phenomena was the outcome, especially when those phenomena demonstrated capabilities beyond known technology. Critics countered that the research sounded like paranormal speculation and carried no obvious military application. In a tightening budget environment, programs that could not clearly define their value were the first to be cut. Internal disagreement worsened the situation. Some officials believed AAWSAP had uncovered the most important intelligence mystery of the modern era and deserved expansion. Others saw it as a dangerous distraction that risked damaging the agency's credibility. Leadership turnover only amplified the divide, as new decision-makers inherited a program they neither approved nor fully understood. But the most decisive factor was liability. By this stage, multiple personnel had reported continued disturbances long after their work at Skinwalker Ranch ended. Some described anxiety, sleep disruption, and stress linked directly to unexplained activity in their homes. Families were affected. Children were affected. The government had no framework for addressing or compensating consequences tied to something it could neither define nor control. Continuing the program meant accepting responsibility for unknown risks that extended far beyond the workplace, and that was a risk no agency could formally accept. When funding expired, AWSAP was quietly dissolved. A much smaller follow-on effort continued under a different name, focusing narrowly on unexplained aerial phenomena and advanced propulsion concepts, stripped of the ranch, the off-site effects, and the most controversial findings. Monitoring at Skinwalker Ranch was reduced, personnel were reassigned, and almost all of the program's reports, data, and conclusions were classified. The investigation didn't end because it failed. It ended because what it uncovered created problems the system was never designed to face. Although AAWSAP officially ended in 2010, the conclusions it reached did not disappear with the funding. Inside classified channels, the program reshaped how the U.S. government viewed unexplained phenomena. The investigation established several points that could no longer be dismissed as speculation. First, the activity associated with Skinwalker Ranch was real and measurable. It was not the result of faulty sensors, exaggeration, or misidentified natural events. Independent instruments repeatedly captured anomalies that violated known physical expectations. Second, the phenomena displayed behavior that appeared responsive and adaptive. It did not manifest randomly. Activity often increased when monitoring intensified and diminished when observations stopped. Experiments rarely repeated under identical conditions, suggesting the phenomenon was not governed by fixed mechanical rules. This alone separated it from weather systems, geological effects, or electromagnetic interference. Third, investigators concluded the phenomena demonstrated capabilities beyond known human technology. Instant acceleration, localized environmental manipulation, and apparent interaction without physical contact were all documented. These characteristics placed the activity outside any known aerospace or defense platform. Whether it represented a future technology, an unknown natural force, or something entirely non-human remained unresolved. Perhaps most troubling was the conclusion that the phenomenon was not bound to location. AAWSAP data showed that exposure, not geography, mattered. Individuals who spent time at the ranch experienced effects later in unrelated locations, sometimes thousands of miles away. This finding fundamentally changed the investigative model. Skinwalker Ranch was no longer viewed as the source, it was the point of contact. These conclusions directly influenced follow-on Pentagon efforts. Later programs studying unexplained aerial phenomena adopted AAWSAP's data standards while carefully avoiding its more controversial associations. The government did not abandon the subject, it narrowed it, rebranded it, and buried the most disruptive implications under classification. Years later, fragments of AAWSAP's work began surfacing. Scientists like Hal Puthoff discussed aspects of the research in limited public forums. James Lakatsky later co-authored a book confirming the government's involvement, though key details remained redacted. These disclosures confirmed what insiders already knew. The investigation validated decades of reports rather than debunking them. A AWSAP didn't solve the mystery of Skinwalker Ranch. What it did was far more unsettling. It proved that the mystery was real, intelligent, and not confined to one place. A conclusion that still shapes how the government approaches the unknown today. When AWSAP was shut down, the public assumption was that the government had lost interest in Skinwalker Ranch. In reality, interest never disappeared. It simply changed form. What ended was the structure of the program, not the concern that had created. The findings were too disruptive to vanish. They were instead absorbed into classified channels where the most unsettling conclusions could be managed quietly. Internally, the government accepted that Skinwalker Ranch had never been the true problem. The ranch was not a container holding the phenomenon. It was a trigger, a place where interaction began. AWSAP data showed that once exposure occurred, distance no longer mattered. Time no longer mattered. The activity followed individuals into their homes, their families, and potentially their workplaces. That single realization redefined the entire risk profile. From a policy standpoint, this created an unsolvable issue. You can restrict access to land, you can shut down facilities, you can terminate contracts, but you cannot contain something that attaches to people rather than places. Continuing the investigation meant knowingly exposing personnel to an unknown variable with no countermeasures, no protective protocols, and no way to reverse its effects. That reality made long-term study ethically and operationally impossible. Years later, fragments of the truth surfaced. Former officials cautiously confirmed the existence of the program. James Lakatsky publicly acknowledged that what he witnessed at the ranch could not be explained within known physics. Other researchers admitted the off-site effects were real, documented, and deeply concerning. Still, the majority of the data remains classified, not because it was trivial, but because it challenged foundational assumptions about reality, security, and human control. The most disturbing conclusion AWSAP reached was also the simplest. The phenomenon did not behave like a force of nature. It behaved like something aware, something selective, something that responded when observed and withdrew when studied too closely. Whether it represents non-human intelligence, an unknown aspect of reality, or a system humanity does not yet understand, remains unresolved. AWSAP did not end with answers. It ended with a boundary the government refused to cross again. Skinwalker Ranch became a lesson rather than a project, proof that some investigations don't fail because they lack evidence, but because the evidence forces questions no institution is prepared to answer. And if the phenomenon truly follows people home, then the most unsettling possibility remains unanswered. It may not be finished with us yet.